Tonight on Bridge City News, assault doesn't just happen in the big cities, it can happen here. We chatted with a woman who had a horrific experience in Lethbridge. You may have noticed smoke and sirens in the Windy City over the past few days, and it was nothing to worry about. We will explain why. And a Calgary couple has been found guilty in the death of their toddler son. We have the details. Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us. You may have noticed a few extra sirens and some smoke in our city. The Lethbridge Fire Department has been training some new recruits. 10 new trainees were donning full protective gear today and fighting a simulated fire originating from a compressed gas vessel. The event trains firefighters as to the safest and most effective way to attack a fire involving flammable liquids. The new recruits say the exercise was quite the educational experience.
For the past 10 weeks, we've been doing primarily our fire training. It's pretty intensive, very physical for the most part, with a fairly heavy didactic portion in the classroom as well. It's been pretty intense. There's a lot more to it than I was expecting, for sure.
Our main purpose with other fires is just kind of putting out the fire itself, like dealing with the ignition source and going from there. With the flammable liquids fire, we're also worried about the tank getting too hot. So while we're kind of dealing with the ignition source, we also have to cool the tank at the same time.
The fire department will have 2 more training exercises between now and November the 1st. Calgary police say a woman was assaulted last night and is in hospital with minor injuries. In the same way, a Lethbridge woman spoke with us today about her recent assault right here in the city.
She was definitely intoxicated on something, and she was a large woman. She was 5'10", muscular. She whipped around and attacked me for not minding my own business. Pulled me by my hair down to the ground. I was on my knees. She was kicking me in the back and really overstretching my neck muscles. It's been traumatic. I've had some anxiety, I guess. I don't know if you want to call them attacks, but I've definitely trembled and cried and just broken down a few times, just realizing wow, I never had that happen to me before, and it's weird to have it happen just a couple blocks away from where you live, or anywhere for that matter.
If you witness a public assault, you're asked to contact police immediately or call Crime Stoppers at 1-800-222-TIPS. That's 1-800-222-8477. Indigenous-themed costumes have been pulled from the shelves of the Halloween store Spirit Halloween in Lethbridge. The company decided to yank the costumes after complaints by a group from the Blood Reserve who said the costumes portrayed First Nations wrongly. The protest was launched by Lori Braverock, who said the costumes were racist. Her concerns were taken to Spirit Halloween's corporate head office in the United States, which notified this store here in Lethbridge to pull the costumes from their shelves. Even though certain areas of Lethbridge have a negative stigma attached to them, there is regrowth happening. Now that's according to the Downtown BRZ, which says areas along 5th Street South have an occupancy rate now of about 95%. Executive Director Ted Stilson does attribute the opioid crisis in our city to some of the problems in the area, but claims that hasn't deterred businesses from moving in.
We're seeing increased aggressive panhandling. We're seeing some other issues associated with that. But on the other side, we're also addressing that. We're working closely with the City of Lethbridge. We're working closely with Lethbridge Police Services, and we're trying to balance out that with some more protection and safety for our members in the downtown core.
The BRZ will appear before the Community Issues Committee at 1:30 p.m. on Monday to discuss further issues pertaining to the 5th Street area. Lethbridge needs more playtime for kids. Now that's according to Vicki Hazelwood from the Lethbridge Early Years Coalition, who presented an initiative to City Council on Monday. Hazelwood is the spokesperson for the Lethbridge Play Charter, a strategy that campaigns for more playtime for our youth.
Play is essential to healthy child development, and Calgary adopted a play charter, and learning from them, we saw the importance of having this as well in Lethbridge. A play charter essentially is a document that outlines why we believe play is important and how, in working together, we can create a community that supports and encourages comprehensive play opportunities for all Lethbridge children. So the play charter will provide a framework for organizations to consider in their planning and their policy and their decision making. As well, it provides common language for organizations and agencies to understand and partner with and work together on.
The Lethbridge Play Charter will be signed by Mayor Chris Spearman Friday, November 16th at City Hall during the National Day of the Child celebrations. The Southern Alberta couple who was charged with failing to provide the necessaries of life for their child ran into a few snags yesterday. David and Colette Stephan told the judge at a pretrial conference they still have not received disclosure for the new trial. The new trial is set to begin June 3rd of next year. The Stephans were found guilty in 2016 for failing to provide the necessaries of life for the 19-month-old son Ezekiel, who died from meningitis in 2012. They received a new trial by the Supreme Court when it was determined the trial judge did not properly instruct jurors. This time around, the Stephans have decided to be tried by a judge alone. A Calgary couple has been found guilty of failing to provide the necessaries of life for their toddler son. A jury found Jennifer and Jeremy Clark guilty in a Calgary court yesterday. Jurors ruled the couple were negligent in not ensuring the child was properly nourished for weeks. He died less than 24 hours after being admitted to hospital on November 28th of 2013. According to a pathologist, the boy died from a staph infection due to a skin condition and malnutrition. The couple will remain on bail pending sentencing. A 34-year-old Lethbridge man has been charged in connection with a robbery where a female employee was assaulted. Kyle John Thoreau entered a liquor store on 8th Avenue North yesterday just after 7 p.m. with a bag over his head, armed with a knife. He pinned a 51-year-old woman against a wall with a knife to her throat before fleeing with an undisclosed amount of cash. He was arrested a short time later and the cash was recovered. Thoreau faces a long list of charges including robbery and assault. Justice Minister Jody Wilson-Raybould tabled legislation yesterday aimed at strengthening laws against bestiality and animal fighting. The bill expands the definition to include any contact for a sexual purpose.
The court ruled that the existing definition of bestiality only covers penetrative acts. In direct response to that decision, Bill C-84 will add a definition of bestiality provisions in the criminal code to make it clear that the offense prohibits any contact for a sexual purpose between a person and an animal. Research shows a well-established link between bestiality and child sex abuse, as well as other forms of violence. By ensuring that all forms of bestiality are protected, the criminal justice system will better protect animals from cruelty and violence, as well as our most vulnerable from being exposed to terrible acts. Let me be clear, this amendment has no application to legitimate animal husbandry or veterinary practices.
Julie Payette says it's one of the greatest privileges to serve as Governor General. While on her first official visit to Saskatchewan, Payette was asked about her recent criticism for her first year in the role.
I think this is one of the greatest privilege. You can see around me young people who represent our future. Are going to stay at school for a long time, and this is what we do. We represent, we honor Canadians, we serve Canada because there's a constitutional role, and more importantly, we showcase. We bring light on important people.
What do you make of the criticism that's made recently of your office?
Well, they should come and spend a few days with us. If you would like to.
Sure.
Please come.
Welcome to.
Please.
100 volunteers have joined the search for a Wisconsin girl who went missing earlier this week and whose parents were shot and killed in their home.
We're not doing extensive wooded searches. There's no aerial assets involved today. It's engaging the civilian corps to help us out to search a large area looking for any items of interest. What that may be, we don't know until we see it. The public has been very vocal about wanting to be involved in this local case. We're engaging the public with a large search area that we can utilize them for. This is something they can help us with. Searches are going to be with credentialed officers in every group. We're looking for items of interest. It could be a gun. Any items of interest. There's a lot of things that aren't. There's going to be a lot of litter in the ditch. We're just ruling in or out an area that is a major travel corridor from the scene and to the scene.
U.S. President Donald Trump praised Montana's Republican Congressman Greg Gianforte for body slamming a reporter from The Guardian during the 2017 election campaign. Gianforte pleaded guilty to misdemeanor assault after the incident.
But Greg is smart. And by the way, never wrestle him. You understand that? Never. Any guy that can do a body slam, he's my kind. He's my guy. I shouldn't say this because there's nothing to be embarrassed about. So I was in Rome with a lot of the leaders from other countries talking about all sorts of things, and I heard about it. And we endorsed Greg very early, but I had heard that he body slammed a reporter. And he was way up. And he was way up, and I said, oh, this was like the day of the election or just before. And I said, oh, this is terrible. He's going to lose the election. Then I said, well, wait a minute. I know Montana pretty well. I think it might help him. And it did.
Meanwhile, earlier in the day, U.S. President Donald Trump was asked if he thought Washington Post writer Jamal Khashoggi was dead.
Okay, Jamal Khashoggi is dead. It certainly looks that way to me. It's very sad. It certainly looks that way. No, just that we're waiting for some investigations and waiting for the results, and we'll have them very soon. And I think we'll be making a statement, a very strong statement. But we're waiting for the results of about 3 different investigations, and we should be able to get to the bottom fairly soon. Mr. President, what are you considering for possible consequences you thought based on those? Well, it'll have to be very severe. I mean, it's bad stuff, but we'll see what happens.
Olympic cross-country skiing champion Chandra Crawford shares why her proudest moment was placing 43rd at the Sochi Winter Olympics. Crawford was recently inducted into Canada Sports Hall of Fame.
I am most proud of, in my 3rd Olympics, I placed 43rd. Now the story is, I was burnt out from my sport. I was struggling in my personal life. I developed an eating disorder in my late 20s, even though I founded a not-for-profit to encourage girls. When I made it to the 2014 Games, I had overcome so much, and I had to decide. I was in a real low, and I had to decide, should I go off the antidepressants I'm on that are keeping me happy? What if there's a performance boost? It was very scary, but I decided go off the antidepressants in case there's a performance boost. I did a lot of soul searching and work on my mental state and my life state, and I achieved going to the Games, and I achieved placing 43rd. I skied Sochi in Russia, and I was so proud of crossing that finish line. From all the personal growth that I had experienced, it's my special gold medal for me.
It was on this date that the stock market crash hit Wall Street in the late 1980s. Napoleon's forces began their retreat from Moscow, and the Concorde made its first landing in New York City. This is Today in History for October the 19th.
October 19th, 1781. The decisive victory in the Revolutionary War. British troops under Lord Cornwallis surrendered to American and French forces at the Battle of Yorktown in Virginia. In a peace treaty a few years later, Britain officially recognizes the independence of its former colonies, the United States. 1987. A stock market crash on Wall Street. The Dow Jones plunges 508 points, or 22.6% in value. That's the second biggest one-day percentage drop for the Dow ever. 1812. French forces under Napoleon Bonaparte begin a disastrous retreat from Moscow. Tens of thousands of troops die from hunger, cold, and Russian attacks during the retreat as winter arrives early. And 1977, the supersonic Concorde makes its first landing in New York City. Today in History, October 19th. Nancy Lyons, The Associated Press.
I remember watching the Concorde fly over my elementary school in Calgary, and if you blinked, well, you missed it. It was that fast. A beautiful day for sky gazing today, lots of sunshine and warm temperatures, and that trend will continue for the weekend. I'll have all the weather details coming up shortly. Another warm fall day in Lethbridge, and not a bad evening shaping up either. Mainly clear tonight with a low near 4. Tomorrow mainly sunny with a high near 19. Sunday a clear sky moving in with the temperature dropping slightly to 14. Monday, mainly sunny again with a high near 15. Tuesday, even warmer with a high near 18 degrees. Wednesday, sunshine, blue sky, and a high expected near 19. Looking at the almanac, the average high for this time of year is 13 degrees and an average low of 0. The highest temperature on this date was recorded in 1974 at 28 degrees, and the record low was minus 12 in 1949. Sunrise was at 7:59, sunset at 6:34. Let's have a look at how tomorrow's shaping up across the country. It'll be mainly foggy and 15 in Vancouver. Victoria, on the other hand, will be mainly sunny and 17. Calgary will also be sunny and should get up to 15 degrees on Saturday. Slightly cooler in Edmonton at 14 degrees. Regina will have a mainly clear sky and 9. Saskatoon will also be sunny and 12 degrees. Winnipeg will be considerably cooler, partly cloudy and only +2 tomorrow. Rain and 10 degrees expected in Toronto. Slightly warmer and showers, 11 degrees in Ottawa. Montreal will also have rain off and on and should get up to 14. Over the Maritimes, Fredericton, New Brunswick will be overcast, rainy and 13. Halifax, Nova Scotia will also have showers and 15. Charlottetown, PEI will have rain and 14. And in St. John's, Newfoundland, a mixture of sun and cloud and a high near 10 degrees tomorrow. Despite a pair of soft economic reports which came out today, it appears as though the Bank of Canada may be raising interest rates next week. Canada's central bank attributes an overall stronger economy and the new trade deal between Canada, the United States, and Mexico as the biggest factors. Retail sales fell 0.1% month over month in August, and Canadian inflation fell unexpectedly 0.4% in September. The markets are betting on a 25 basis point increase to 1.75%. There's one company which is calling on Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau to cut corporate taxes ahead of his fall fiscal update. Our parliamentary reporter Ray Fillion says Canada Inc. is saying businesses simply won't come to Canada without more of a tax break.
Right now, Canada Inc. is basically saying if you're an international company from Europe or Asia looking to invest in North America, you look at corporate tax rates in Canada, corporate tax rates in the United States, the choice they say is quite obvious. You're going to be investing in the US and not Canada.
Catch my full interview with Mr. Fillion as we discuss taxes on businesses and why legal cannabis may be a bad gamble for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. That is coming up after business news. Kinder Morgan announced recently that the twinning of the Trans Mountain pipeline will cost an additional $1.9 billion. There's also a delay of at least a year before more pipe can be laid. Many believe even though Ottawa bought the pipeline, it may die thanks to a multitude of delays. Alberta MP and Natural Resources Shadow Minister Shannon Stubbs says the Liberals have a history of killing energy contracts.
The Liberals have driven away $100 billion of energy investments and projects that have been canceled. And to put that in context, which I think is important, the amount of energy investment lost in a 2-year period under the Liberals so far is more than any other comparable 2-year period in more than 70 years.
Catch my entire interview with Alberta MP and Natural Resources Shadow Minister Shannon Stubbs coming up in the second half of our show. China has imposed a crippling $1.3 billion fine on a company responsible for faulty vaccines given to hundreds of thousands of kids. The fine against Shanshun Changsheng Biotechnology dwarfs previous penalties imposed on vaccine makers. The company's chairwoman and 14 other executives have also been banned from ever working in the vaccine industry. They're all under investigation and could face criminal charges. According to the Chinese government, the company used expired vaccine materials, changed production batch numbers, and destroyed and fabricated production records. The company also destroyed a computer to cover up its illegal acts. Now, here's a look at today's markets. Recapping one of our top stories this hour, the Alberta couple who was charged with failing to provide the necessaries of life for their child ran into some problems in court yesterday. David and Colette Stephan told the judge at a pretrial conference that they still have not received disclosure for their new trial. The new trial is set to begin June 3rd of next year. The Stephans were found guilty in 2016 for failing to provide the necessaries of life for their 19-month-old son Ezekiel, who died in 2012 from meningitis. When you see news happening, drop us an email at info@bridgecitynews.ca. And if you missed any of today's top stories, check out our full newscast online at bridgecitynews.ca. Now that recreational use marijuana is legal in Canada, it could be a gamble that may backfire on Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. That's according to our parliamentary reporter Ray Fillion. Hear what Ray has to say next. But first, here's a look at what's happening in and around your community.
Here's your Bridge City News community calendar. Playgoers of Lethbridge will present their annual dinner theater Till Beth Do Us Part from October 23rd to the 27th at Country Kitchen Catering. This show is a raucous comedy about romance and revenge. Tickets are $55 and are available at Casa. Come to the Great Canadian Garage Sale at the Lethbridge Exhibition Park's main pavilion on October 27th beginning at 8:30 a.m. Take in a number of private garage sales in one location, offering unique items and tons of treasures from household items to furniture and more. Booth rentals are free and can be done online at greatcanadiangaragesale.com. Admission is $8 or $6 with a non-perishable food donation to the Lethbridge Food Bank. The Nigerian Canadian Association of Lethbridge and the Sobo Yijo Turning Point Foundation are presenting a symposium on global migration and Canadian immigration on Saturday, October 27th at the main public library, downtown Lethbridge from 2 to 5 p.m. Hear from top experts about the challenges and opportunities immigration presents to our communities and country. Admission is free and all are welcome. And that's your Bridge City News community calendar.
Recreational use marijuana is now legal in our country. Thousands of Canadians have been lighting up in celebration. Joining me now from Ottawa is our parliamentary reporter, Ray Fillion. Ray, legal cannabis may actually be a huge gamble for Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. Can you explain?
Well, it's a risky venture, obviously, for the Prime Minister of Canada, because what if things go wrong? I mean, what if we see all of a sudden a string of road accidents caused by motorists who've been driving while they were high? Obviously, if that happens anywhere in the country, Justin Trudeau would have fingers pointed at him because he's the architect of that legalization. The opposition would have a field day. The Conservatives, obviously, as you know, were staunchly against legalizing marijuana. This week, we saw some of them talking about a black day for Canada. One of their MPs actually made a point of showing up in the House of Commons all dressed in black because he called it a day of mourning for Canada. Now, that being said, we'll see what happens. But the Conservatives hinted this week that they're not going to roll back that legislation. One of their MPs said publicly that, legal weed is here to stay in Canada. What they might do if they form the next government, he says, is perhaps amend the current legislation, tweak it a bit, but I think it's a new era for Canada, and for better or worse, weed is now legal in this country. So we'll see what happens. And at the same time, Hal, this is a campaign promise that Justin Trudeau made in 2015, and he couldn't back away from it. It was such a high-profile promise. It helped him get reelected. As you know, he reneged on some campaign promises like electoral reform, a balanced budget this year. As you know, federal deficits are much higher than he said they would be during the election campaign. But legalizing marijuana was such a high-profile campaign promise. He could not back away from it. So he delivered the goods a full year before the election. Was Canada ready for it? I guess we're going to find out in the coming months.
A story we recently had on BCN is how the feds are looking into legislation which would offer those convicted of simple possession will be able to obtain a pardon. Now, what's the reasoning behind this?
Well, it's because many of those people who were convicted for simple possession over the years have a criminal record, and having a criminal record makes it harder for you to find a job. So the Canadian government wants to help these people obtain a pardon, which would make it easier for them to get a job, travel to most countries, although not to the United States, because this is not a blanket amnesty that they're going to be granting people who were convicted over the years. It's going to be done on a case-by-case basis. So when you show up at the Canadian-American border, the U.S. customs agent, when they swipe your passport, they're still going to be able to see that you've been convicted for an offense that is still illegal at the federal level in the United States, even though many American jurisdictions have decided to go the same way as Canada just did by legalizing cannabis. The NDP was calling for a blanket amnesty, which would have erased the criminal records of all these people. The federal government has decided to go a different route. Instead, they're going to be treating each case separately on a case-by-case basis. They're going to facilitate the process. So they're going to make it free, for one thing. Right now, if you want to get a pardon for a criminal offense, it costs roughly $650. They're going to make it free. And it's not going to happen overnight. They still have to table legislation in the Commons. That bill is going to have to go through the motions. So it's probably not before the end of the year that people are going to be able to apply for a pardon.
You know what's interesting as well, Ray, is the fact that some of the immigration lawyers I've chatted with and the border security officers I've chatted with as well said, if you admit in Canada that you've smoked pot, they can refuse entrance for you into the United States. So I'm thinking, wait a minute, our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, admitted that he smoked pot in the past. And what about NHL players? A recent survey says that, more than 50% of them have smoked pot in the past. How are they going to get into the United States to play the American teams?
Well, if you haven't been caught, you don't have a criminal record. So, Justin Trudeau wasn't caught. He was never arrested. So it's not going to be a problem. Plus, he has a diplomatic passport as the Prime Minister of Canada. And I think that former parliamentarians get to keep those after they leave office, certainly former Prime Ministers. So I don't think it's going to be a problem for him. But yeah, NHL players, that's an interesting question. I guess if they were never caught, they were never convicted, they don't have a record, so no problem for them getting into the U.S.
Now, tensions are running a little high in Ottawa recently as Andrew Scheer and the federal Tories said they would have negotiated a better trade deal than the Liberals did with the United States and Mexico with the deal now known as the USMCA. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that was quite interesting. Actually, Mr. Scheer, the leader of the Conservative Party of Canada, took to Twitter last Sunday and he wrote, and I quote, "The U.S. are measuring their victory by what they gained. We are measuring ours by what we didn't give up. Would I have signed this deal? I would have signed a better one," wrote Mr. Scheer on Sunday. He didn't say exactly what would have been different in that deal that he claims would have been better between the United States and Canada. And the truth is, of course, we'll never find out because, Mr. Scheer is not Prime Minister of Canada. He didn't get to negotiate. And I don't think that that no one in Canada wants to renegotiate, certainly not with Donald Trump, another deal anytime soon. And, Chrystia Freeland, Canada's Foreign Affairs Minister, who was in charge of that whole renegotiation process with the United States and Mexico, she fired back, accusing the Conservative leader of showing a lot of Monday morning courage. So what I think this is a lot of electoral posturing. We're getting near the next election. It's in roughly a year from today. So right. I think the rhetoric is starting to show here.
Ray, the federal Tories are holding a big rally in Ottawa this weekend on Sunday. What's the occasion?
Well, the occasion is exactly that. On Sunday, October 21st, we're going to be exactly 1 year away from the next election. And the Conservatives have decided to mark this pre-anniversary, if you will, 1 year to the day from the next election with a rally here in the nation's capital. We're expecting a few hundred people. Andrew Scheer is going to be delivering a speech to try and motivate his troops for the big electoral battle that's going to take place pretty soon. Pretty much all the Conservative MPs from across Canada are going to be here. We're hearing that many staffers, obviously, but also some Conservative candidates for the next elections are going to be on hand. So that's going to be an interesting day. And, we're sensing, watching question period in the House of Commons on a daily basis here since Parliament resumed sitting in mid-September. You get a sense that we're getting close to very close to the election, the next election. It's a little meaner right now in the House of Commons, especially between the Tories and the Liberals.
It might be a little early in the game, but what's your sense? Are you getting a feeling that maybe Maxime Bernier's new party, the People's Party of Canada, may be taking some of the momentum or potential votes or support away from the Tories? What are you hearing?
Mr. Bernier says he is, but we're not seeing that right now. This is not something we're hearing on the ground. He's getting a lot of attention from the media. He's getting a lot of attention from people. Like he claims that he now has roughly 25,000 members across the country. But there was a poll that was published this week, and his support across the country is only 1.3%. That's not a lot. You're not in the game with only 1.3%. So we'll see what happens. As we said last week, Mr. Bernier says that his party is going to be there. He's going to be running candidates in each of Canada's 338 ridings next year in the next election. That's a big endeavor. But as it stands right now, I don't see him going very far, certainly not in the next election. Maybe in 2 or 3 elections, we'll see what happens. But for now, I don't think it's going to damage Mr. Scheer's Conservatives a lot.
Ray, Ottawa's official residences, including 24 Sussex Drive, will be requiring an $83 million investment. Tell me more about that.
$83 million over the next 10 years to restore and maintain the 6 official residences here in the nation's capital, including 24 Sussex, which is, of course, the official residence of the Prime Minister of Canada. It's literally falling apart. A report from the NCC, the National Capital Commission, which oversees all official residences in the nation's capital, said this week that 24 Sussex and Harrington Lake, which is the Prime Minister's cottage in the Gatineau Hills across the river from here, are in critical shape as a result of chronic underfunding. So a lot more money is required just to maintain those residences. The same report said that the other official residences, like Rideau Hall, which is the Governor General's official residence, Stornoway, the official residence of the Leader of the Official Opposition, 7 Rideau Gate, and the home of the Speaker of the House of Commons are in better shape, but still require major investments. And as I said, this is just to keep them afloat. 24 Sussex Drive has been a problem for many years. As you know, Justin Trudeau hasn't lived there since he became Prime Minister 3 years ago. He's been living at in a residence called Rideau Cottage, which is on the estate of the Governor General. And he has yet to make, his government has yet to make a decision on 24 Sussex Drive. And you have this debate here in the nation's capital. What do we do about it? Do we just tear it down, build something new? Does the Prime Minister even need an official residence now that the Prime Minister has been living for 3 years at Rideau Cottage alongside the Governor General? So the debate rages on, but one thing is for sure, that residence is falling apart, and just fixing it, making it good enough for the Prime Minister to live there with his family, with all the security requirements, would cost probably tens of millions of dollars. And I think that that's the reason why the Trudeau Liberals haven't made a decision. They don't want to make that kind of an investment, or announce that kind of an investment for the Prime Minister before Canadians go to the polls. I think that this is something they're voluntarily punting for later on in his second or perhaps third mandate, if he gets one, of course.
Ray, Canada Post employees are threatening rotating strike action on Monday if there's no deal struck.
Still no deal. In fact, talks have been going on for months. And at the end of summer, we started hearing about a possible strike action or a lockout. It didn't happen. Talks continued. But now this week, the union served notice that they're going to be on strike. They're going to be holding rotating strikes across the country if no deal is signed before, or if no deal is concluded between the parties before this weekend. We're talking, as I said, about rotating strikes. So it's not mail delivery across the country that would be affected. It would be one region of the country one day, another part of the country the other day. We don't know where they're going to be starting if there are rotating strikes on Monday. Well, that's going to make things interesting for a lot of people who want to order cannabis, because in some provinces, including here in Ontario, there are no pot shops yet. They're going to be opening the first cannabis stores in April of 2019. The only way to get your cannabis if you live here in Ontario is if you order online and you get it delivered to your door by mail. So what happens if there's no postal service on Monday? It's going to be interesting, and I think it's going to make a lot of consumers unhappy.
Canada Inc. is calling on Federal Finance Minister Bill Morneau to cut corporate taxes ahead of his fall fiscal update. Let's talk about that.
Yeah, Canada used to have a competitive advantage where corporate taxes are concerned with the United States. Our corporate tax rates used to be lower, but now it's the other way around as a result of Mr. Trump's reform earlier this year. So a lot of business people, a lot of people in the business community throughout Canada have been spending the last few months putting a lot of pressure on Canada's finance minister ahead of his fall fiscal update, which is expected in a couple of weeks from now, to lower corporate taxes in Canada. The problem is, of course, the Trudeau Liberals are running such high deficits, much higher than they said they would in the last election campaign, that I'm not sure that the finance minister wants to go down that route. So he's looking, we're told, at all kinds of options to try and get Canadian businesses, place them on a level playing field with their American rivals. But right now, Canada Inc. is basically saying, if you're an international company from Europe or Asia looking to invest in North America, you look at corporate tax rates in Canada, corporate tax rates in the United States, the choice, they say, is quite obvious. You're going to be investing in the US and not Canada.
Ontario Premier Doug Ford is making some waves challenging Ottawa's carbon tax. He was just out west here, as you know. And there's word now that Ford has some federal ambitions, Ray.
Well, yeah, he's been campaigning. You saw him in your neck of the woods a few days ago. And now the rumor is Mr. Ford has federal ambitions. He would like to be perhaps the next prime minister, or maybe in 8 years from now, become prime minister of Canada. And he had a pretty stormy encounter with the new intergovernmental affairs minister, Dominique LeBlanc, who was named to that job by Justin Trudeau just last summer. Mr. LeBlanc was in Toronto this week to meet with Mr. Ford, and it didn't go well. As a matter of fact, Mr. LeBlanc said that Doug Ford should focus on his job, not his national ambitions. He even said, Mr. LeBlanc, you get a 4-year job, you're 10% into it, and you're already looking to upgrade. Of course, Doug Ford was elected Ontario Premier just last June, so barely 4 months ago. So, but this is another sign of the stormy relationship that now exists between Ottawa and Queen's Park. The game has gotten a lot more complicated for Justin Trudeau, with new governments in Ontario, in British Columbia, in Quebec, and maybe next spring in Alberta with Jason Kenney. Who knows?
That's right. Looking forward to those elections, provincially and federally. Our parliamentary reporter, Ray Fillion, joining me once again from Ottawa. Thanks so much, Ray.
You're welcome, Hal.
Like it or not, one of the pillars of Canada's economy is still the natural resource sector. We're talking about oil and gas. Now, we've taken a bit of a hit over the years. Will it turn around anytime soon? Joining me now via Skype is federal Conservative MP from Lakeland, Alberta, northeastern Alberta, Shannon Stubbs, the Shadow Minister of Natural Resources. Welcome to Bridge City News, Shannon.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate the opportunity.
You bet. Now, the Liberals recently announced some changes to the federal carbon tax program as it relates to heavy industry like steel. It sounds a bit like the government subsidy to offset the impact of the carbon tax. Can you explain what the Liberals are trying to do here?
Well, they aren't solving the problem at all. What they should actually do is repeal the carbon tax, which particularly in the case of energy, no other major oil and gas producing in the country is imposing on themselves because of the damage it would do to their economy's competitiveness. We have yet to see what the Liberals' final changes will be. They are hinting for some major emitters that they would raise the thresholds after which those emitters would have to pay the carbon tax. But that doesn't solve the problem. What they have to do is listen to the advocacy from other provincial governments, from Canadians from all corners of the country, and remove the carbon tax, because it will harm the competitiveness of energy, of agriculture, of manufacturing, but also disproportionately harm vulnerable Canadians, low-income Canadians, people on fixed incomes, the working poor, the people who can least afford it. It is one of the measures in a long list of Liberals doing economic harm to Canada's best interests.
You know, many people argue this is designed to ensure that investors aren't scared away by the carbon tax. But where's the money coming from to pay for the subsidy?
Well, the reality is this: the Liberals' policies, legislation, and the combination of their red tape and costs across the board is driving investment out of Canada. That's the real crisis facing Canada's economy right now, is this issue of competitiveness. And so they'll have to unveil the final details of the decision that they do make, and we'll hold them to account on that once we have clarity. But the reality is, particularly in the energy sector, the Liberals have driven away $100 billion of energy investments and projects that have been canceled. And to put that in context, which I think is important, the amount of energy investment lost in a 2-year period under the Liberals so far is more than any other comparable 2-year period in more than 7 years, 7 decades. So the Liberals, they spin this narrative that the downturn in the energy sector in Canada is because of global factors or global prices, which happen to be right now at 3-year price highs, or external factors beyond the government's control. But that's not the case at all. The collapse of private sector investment confidence in Canada is because of a series of pieces of legislation and policies, and also because of the carbon tax, which will increase the cost of living for everybody, but also particularly for key industries and businesses in energy, manufacturing, and agriculture.
So Ontario Premier Doug Ford has already said he's going to join forces with Scott Moe and fight the Liberals on this carbon tax. And if Jason Kenney gets in here in Alberta, you could also see another fight. Do you think the Liberals will actually end up scrapping it altogether?
Well, if they believe any of the rhetoric that they ran the last campaign on and continue to spout about, consultation and cooperative federalism and listening to Canadians and working cooperatively with other provincial governments and opposition counterparts. By the way, that was something the Prime Minister said in all of his ministerial mandate letters, that they should de-escalate conflict and work cooperatively. I hope that they do heed that message. Canadians clearly know that it's a cash grab to pay for reckless spending by the Liberals, and I'm glad to see the coalition of provincial governments and Canadians right across the country speaking out against it.
So ever since the cancellation of major projects like Energy East and Northern Gateway Pipeline, has this really caused investors to basically stay away from Canada and invest in other countries?
Yes, it's part of the reason why Kinder Morgan is now trying to get out of their plans to invest $7.4 billion to build the Trans Mountain expansion. But it is also clear in the fact that the energy sector in the United States and in other energy producing countries around the world is booming. Canadian investment in the United States is down 52%. American investment in Canada is up 66%. The United States is already a net exporter of gas and is poised to provide 80% of the world's oil supply in the next 3 years. So the real crisis for Canada that the Liberals have created is that now Canada's #1 energy customer is also a major competitor. And it is clearly a result of the combination of added red tape and costs and anti-energy policies by these Liberals that are driving investment out of Canada and collapsing private sector confidence in our economy.
So where are we at right now then, Shannon, when it comes to Trans Mountain Pipeline? Kinder Morgan says the price tag for twinning the pipeline is now increased $1.9 billion than originally estimated. There's also a 1-year delay in construction.
Right. And in the same way that the Liberals fiddling around with their carbon tax proposals will leave everyday Canadians still on the hook for paying their taxes if they don't repeal it entirely, so too are we asking the Liberals to be accountable about the ultimate cost to taxpayers for the Trans Mountain expansion. When the Finance Minister announced that expenditure, we warned that would likely be only the beginning of the costs. I guess those details of the final agreement will be released on August 30th once Kinder Morgan actually votes. But, just in June, I asked the previous Natural Resources Minister if he could even give an estimate about what he thought the ultimate cost to build the expansion would be for taxpayers. He couldn't. The current Natural Resources Minister can't. The news is out yesterday that it looks like it'll be $2 billion more at a minimum. It's already delayed 2 years, and there will be no new pipeline in the ground in 2018. We know that for sure, and the in-service date continues to be completely uncertain. And remember, all of this is also in the context of the failure of the Liberals to find another private sector proponent and backer of the Trans Mountain expansion by the June 22nd deadline, which goes to your point about the fiasco around the Trans Mountain expansion, which is a result of the Prime Minister's failure of leadership being really about the big picture of a lack of confidence of the private sector in Canada's energy sector.
So in your opinion then, what's caused a lot of these delays, and will we expect more of them down the road?
Well, the ongoing delays to the Trans Mountain expansion was a deliberate, coordinated attempt by anti-energy activists to do what they said they would do, which is to use every tool in their toolbox to kill that pipeline through, as they call it, death by delay. And what was astounding was that, first of all, those activists were very clear and very coordinated about that immediately after the federal approval of Trans Mountain, of the expansion 2 years ago. But also as soon as the NDP Green Coalition came to power in BC. And meanwhile, the Prime Minister sat on his hands for a year and a half. It took him a year and a half before he even talked to the new BC Premier about the Trans Mountain expansion at that time. And so in a last-ditch effort, I guess some sort of attempt to save the Trans Mountain expansion, which is the only remaining viable pipeline project still on the table since the Liberals took office, they've announced this major expenditure, but there's still no clarity around cost to taxpayers, the dates for construction, actually accomplishing the expansion.
And like we talked about before, the newly projected costs for the pipeline are, over $2 billion now, more than originally estimated. Now, what are the odds of the number increasing even more as we get closer and closer to potentially twinning this pipeline and starting construction?
Well, I think it's very likely that the cost will continue to increase because of the delays, especially as long as the delays go on. And that is really part of the failure of this expenditure to purchase the existing Trans Mountain expansion, because the barriers to its completion were politically organized and comprised of anti-energy activism and legal challenges and challenges from other levels of government. So the Prime Minister and the Liberals needed to clearly exert federal jurisdiction and enforce the rule of law to ensure that this federally approved pipeline, which is under federal jurisdiction, which is in the national interest, could proceed. So we will be pressing them strongly in the fall when we're back in session to be clear and accountable to Canadians about what will be the cost to taxpayers and exactly what the path forward will be for the Trans Mountain expansion, which ideally is built, paid for, operated, and maintained by the private sector, by pipeline companies, just like the hundreds of thousands of kilometers in pipelines that exist right now in Canada, which have been built with zero tax dollars under the highest standards in the world.
Now, do you think the Liberals will find a buyer for Trans Mountain, or will they possibly decide to keep it because it's making some good money?
Well, what strikes me is that it's crazy that we're even having this discussion, or that we even have to have this conjecture about who might be the owner of the Trans Mountain expansion and what the path forward is for the pipeline, because Kinder Morgan planned to invest $7.4 billion in this initiative to the benefit of all of Canada. And it is only because of the failure of the Prime Minister's leadership and the lack of the Liberals to champion the Trans Mountain expansion and work with the proponent to ensure that the conditions were set to be able to go ahead and build it, that we are in this place at all. So it's up to the Liberals to answer those questions to Canadians.
Now, I understand that some First Nations groups are considering buying a stake in Trans Mountain, which is kind of interesting, as we've been hearing that so many Indigenous groups are opposed to the pipeline when in fact there's substantial support.
Absolutely right. That's one thing I'm grateful that is being discussed a lot more in the context of the Trans Mountain expansion. Now, but again, already under Kinder Morgan, the Trans Mountain expansion had $400 million worth of benefit agreements with multiple Indigenous communities. Every single Indigenous community directly crossed and impacted by the Trans Mountain expansion supported the expansion, and 43 communities worked really hard to establish these mutual benefit agreements with Kinder Morgan. So it's a positive thing if Indigenous communities and businesses are looking at being able to invest directly in a stake in a pipeline. But as you point out, the reality is, despite the myth and the narrative from all the anti-energy activists, the vast majority of Indigenous communities in Canada support energy development, they support pipelines, and they were already invested as partners in the Trans Mountain expansion in partnership with Kinder Morgan.
So Shannon, what would a Conservative government do if you win the election in 2019? And how would you bring back major investment into the natural resource sector?
That will be a number one priority for Canada's Conservatives if we are elected in 2019, because the reality is energy is the number one private sector investor in the Canadian economy. It is Canada's second biggest export. It increases this. It is a major driver of Canada's high standard of living, and it benefits every Canadian, every community, in every corner of the country. And the flight of capital investment out of the energy sector from Canada is a direct result of the combined impact of anti-energy legislation, like the new energy regulations, which cause uncertainty around timeliness and requirements in the approval process, and I'll open the door for even more foreign interference in the review process for energy projects, like the tanker ban that eliminates the ability to export Canadian oil to the Asia Pacific. So Canada's Conservatives, if we are elected in 2019, certainly will have our work cut out for us to restore confidence in private sector investment in the Canadian economy, to repeal unnecessary red tape, to reduce costs, while maintaining the highest environmental standards and the highest track record of socially responsible and environmentally responsible energy production in the world, for which Canada has long been renowned.
Shannon, let's talk a bit about that tweet from Global Affairs Canada attacking Saudi Arabia when it comes to their human rights issues. Now, Saudi Arabia may be saying, you know what, that's it for Canada. You guys are cut off when it comes to oil. How would that impact Canada?
Well, that would be a serious concern on the East Coast, and it invites, I think, a discussion again about the proposal of the nation-building Energy East pipeline, which would have been able to bring Western Canadian crude oil to Eastern Canadian refineries. Eastern Canadian refiners are heavily dependent on both American oil and also foreign oil from Middle Eastern countries, simply because of a lack of cross-country infrastructure to take Western resources for refining in St. John. And so that is real consequences for importing and the use of Canadian oil on the East Coast. But again, you know, in the larger context of the issues that we're talking about, that was an instant where the private sector proponent was ready and willing and dedicated to making a multi-billion-dollar major nation-building infrastructure investment to create thousands of jobs across the country, 15,000 in New Brunswick, and to be able to both secure Canada's energy independence, but also diversify Canada's export markets by shipping to Europe, which is more necessary than ever, given that the U.S. is now our major energy competitor. And TransCanada was forced to abandon Energy East, not because of liberal like oil prices and business decisions like the Liberal spin said it was, but as a direct result of the Liberals causing a year and a half of regulatory uncertainty, constant changes, and then imposing a last-minute double standard of upstream and downstream emissions as a condition for pipeline approval, which they don't apply to foreign oil and which isn't applied, frankly, to any other major infrastructure in any other sector across the country. And so while I think what is going on the trade file, not just on this issue, but on a number of issues, shows major failures on the part of the Prime Minister and the Liberal government, at least this may generate again a conversation about working with, again, TransCanada or any private sector proponent who might be willing to come back to the table to propose that nation-building pipeline infrastructure from the west to the east.
So Shannon, you're an MP in Lakeland, Alberta, northeastern Alberta. I'm here in Lethbridge, Alberta, and like we've been discussing, Alberta is heavy in natural resources. What can Alberta do to become that economic powerhouse, that economic engine again that turns Canada?
Well, the key thing will be, I think, as a first step, up to Albertans in the next provincial election, and then as a second step, probably up to Canadians in the next federal election. The reality is that the formula that made Alberta the economic driver of the country to the benefit of all Canadians, and before made Canada an attractive place to do business, are streamlined regulations that accomplish the objectives that all Canadians care about in terms of consultation with impacted communities, consultation with Indigenous communities, the highest environmental standards in the world, and ongoing innovation to continue to produce the most responsible oil and gas on the planet, while also creating the economic conditions through non-punitive taxes and streamlined regulations and rules to attract the private sector investment in the economy. And Alberta has been hit hard by the downturn in the energy sector and the hundreds of thousands of people whose livelihoods depend on it. But the impact in Alberta is dominoing right across the country, and it has an impact in every province. But this is the thing that I hope Albertans and Canadians will know when they go to the polls. It is not a result of external factors or factors that are beyond the control of policymakers and elected representatives in Canada. It is a direct result of policy, legislation, and fiscal frameworks that are driving out business investment, and these are the consequences.
Well, we have two big elections coming up next year, 2019, the Alberta provincial and the federal election. Federal Conservative MP Shannon Stubbs and the Shadow Minister for Natural Resources, thanks a lot for your time today.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
On behalf of all of us here at Bridge City News, I'm Hal Roberts. God bless and have a great night.